Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial.
And I'm Jack Russell, Sales and Marketing Manager of the United States Naval Institute Press.
And today, we've got a video to talk about one of the blueprints that USNI has in their collection. And today's video, of course, is sponsored by Naval Institute Press. And be sure to check the link in the description down below for access to some of their products that are out. We're coming up on the holiday season. I know you guys need Christmas presents, and I know if you're watching this, you'll probably like some of the books that they put out.
Make sure to check out our website because we are running a holiday promo. It's about 50% off and free shipping. That'll be running. Again, check out the website for more details.
So, Jack, what have you pulled out for us today?
All right, so this is a very interesting plan and one that for years, whenever it came up on the internet, it was usually just like fan fiction, right? So this was popularized early this year by World of Warships, right? So this entered their game and people thought, no, this is just Russian fantasy, right? Okay. This is actually a real design. And not only is it a real design, it's not Italian or Soviet. This is actually done by Gibbs and Cox here in the United States in the 1930s, right? And so this is an original blueprint for this ship. To Gibbs and Cox, it was sort of, a fantasy fun project. Ship X is what they called it internally, not to be confused with other Ship X's of, in naval history. To the Russians, it's Project 1058.1, I believe.
I hate the Russian project numbers. I can never keep them straight.
Right. And so this is just, as Stalin was getting more and more impatient as the 1930s went on, he was just like, hey, I realize I'm not going to be able to build this huge battleship armada, this huge fleet. So give me a ship that I can have one or two of that would be, for the time, the end all of designs. And so that included a ship that was over 1,000 feet long, that weighed Yamato, so this is something like 72,000 tons, right?
It's interesting that you mentioned Yamato because it's a very similar philosophy that the Japanese are coming up with.
Right.
They're going to have to face the United States and they cannot match them ship for ship. Well, Russia has to divide its ships among 4 different oceans so they can never concentrate their fleet. They have to build enough ships in every single ocean to be able to win.
So, right, exactly. And so when the ship is designed, they're like, well, we want 2 of them, one for the Pacific and one for potentially, Atlantic, Baltic, those theaters. So, you're absolutely right. And the armor is huge. The armor belt is something like 16 inches, somewhere again, like between 12 and 16. Again, we're talking Yamato numbers.
And you can see on the drawing that it does extend from the forwardmost turret to the aftermost turret. So it covers everything, but that's got to be over 800 feet of length. That's an Iowa-class battleship's full length.
Right. Absolutely. To move this ship over 1,000 feet, we're talking Gerald R. Ford shaft horsepower spread over 6 shafts. So something like 330,000 shaft horsepower. And today, on Gerald R. Ford, that's achieved using nuclear reactors over 4 shafts, right? So to think this is using like a traditional steam turbine setup of the time, it's very similar to the steam turbines that ultimately would, find their way into Battleship New Jersey and other large sort of U.S. ships during World War II. But to think 330,000, a third more than an Iowa-class battleship, 2 additional shafts. It's just...
Only the United States could design a ship with that kind of shaft horsepower because we were the only ones with those sorts of lightweight boilers that could produce that at this time.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because technically this ship couldn't have been built, period. So there were no yards in the world, in the United States, that were capable of building this ship at the time, right? In the contract that was being drawn up with the Soviets, the Soviets would have to pay for U.S. dockyard expansion to be able to build this ship.
Well, that's a good deal for the United States.
Well, right. It's like, okay, cool. Like we'll take your money. We'll build your fantasy battleship. which may or may not actually do anything. By the time it's done, it'll be outdated. We don't care. And you've just paid for our yards to be expanded so we can build gigantic ships in a upcoming war that may or may not happen.
Well, and remember what happens in Great Britain with all the ships that they're building prior to World War I. The war starts, and now the Royal Navy has all these new ships that were going to all these other countries.
Right. So exactly. This originally came about because Stalin wanted to purchase battleships or battleship components from the United States. And then its other shipbuilding ally, Italy, would provide basically like the main sort of details and drawings. And then so you'd end up with Italian-looking battleships with like U.S. manufactured guns. And in reality, that's what happens, right? So Sovietsky Soyuz, right, which gets laid down instead of this, right, as sort of a home-built Russian thing, is based on Italian plans, right? And the 16-inch gun that Russia ultimately develops is based on plans that they had purchased from the United States. Now, obviously, it's refined and homegrown, and but at the end of the day, it's hard to say, okay, that was a 100% Soviet manufactured weapon. Okay, so you do end up with this Italian-esque design, refined by the Russians, an American gun, refined by the Russians, but of course, Sovietsky Soyuz and its various siblings that were ordered were ultimately put on hold with the outbreak of war, canceled, scrapped. So this is very much a fantasy project. Had these been started, so for instance, instead of Sovietsky Soyuz, it was ultimately the U.S. Navy which put pressure on the Roosevelt administration that got these ships canceled, right? So originally Roosevelt was like, I see no problem here, right? This should be fine, It was the Navy who was like, we really don't want these ships anywhere else, right? So, I mean, you can imagine why, because eventually they might have to get sunk by U.S. warships, right? So, but also, obviously there was this huge anti-Soviet, anti-communist, feelings, and that played into it. And so eventually, Roosevelt did order the whole negotiations, everything having to do with this ship, the Russians buying battleship parts, all that to just stop, and then please leave. But had these been laid down, right, it would have been about 1938, 1939, right? Well, so holding all things equal, right? So now you have this ship, which by 1941 is could potentially be enough to float out, or what do you think?
Yeah, certainly 2 years to build it, at least the launching point, and probably another 2 years to fit out and complete.
So, I mean, by 1941, especially as Germany invades, with Operation Barbarossa, right? I mean, the Russian Navy is basically neutralized, right? I mean, the Russian Navy plays very little, as a very little role in World War II. Yes, they have small engagements here and there in the Baltic, but nothing that could sustain or support or use anything like this, right? I mean, and so the idea is that the U.S. Navy then, in 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor, has now this 1,000-foot long super armored hull, right? So what do you do with it, right? Do you...
I'm guessing that with 6 propellers, this is far in excess of 108 feet wide.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
there's no Panama Canal restrictions here.
Right, for the Russians.
This is, yeah.
So this is being built probably in an East Coast yard.
In New York, somewhere between, so they hadn't, no one had, obviously that detail hadn't been finalized, but it was either Philadelphia, New York, one of the two were being looked at for expansion, right?
Yeah, I don't think we had any thing that could even be expanded this big on the West Coast. It almost certainly had to be New York, Philadelphia, or maybe Norfolk at that point. So this is being built on the East Coast of the United States, theoretically. You've got the hull at this point, super armored, and too big to fit through the Panama Canal. Yikes.
So, one of the hypotheses is, well, if it's finished as is, let's say hypothetically, right? Okay, if it's finished as is, as this 12, 16-inch guns, flight deck. Well, this flight deck between sort of the first, the armored conning tower and right behind, the third turret there. Mm-hmm. Well, that might be all well and good for, a 1930s era aircraft, right? Even maybe early 1940s, right? You're not putting Hellcats on this, right? You probably Wildcats at best, maybe, right?
Yeah, it's certainly not something as big as an Avenger.
Right. So, so it's finishing it off as a hybrid warship, especially after like 1941, is pretty silly, unless you were doing just basic scouting, maybe some fighter protection, that sort of thing. Obviously, as a 12-gun battleship, that's still a pretty good armament. But these flight decks here and again aft, right? They're angled, but it still would really reduce your firing angles.
Right.
Right.
The Iowas can turn their guns almost 270 degrees to fire over the shoulder at ships pretty close to behind them or ahead of them to get all of their turrets to aim.
So for instance, on like Issei, right, the Japanese converted that 2 class during the war. Well, so that's a 6-gun ship. The aftmost turrets were completely removed, but then you have the 2 turrets sort of in the center, right? But the massive aircraft facilities now over the stern, and then the buildup of anti-aircraft emplacements, those middle turrets are completely pointless, mm-hmm. right? Unless they're trained perfectly, to port or starboard, right? You're not.
Which means shore bombardment functionally.
Right. So something similar to this. The turret angles aren't going to be that great. And so with a ship also that size and with this massive sort of midships superstructure and hangar facility and, this would take a lot of enemy fire. And they would take a lot of damage.
And that's not armored, so all the aircraft fuel, the bombs.
Right.
And even if the ship's main armor belt, could sustain, 16 or 18-inch shells, right? After they've completely raked the whole deck, what do you have left, So, definitely a very odd design, very much a fantasy project, But what's really sort of interesting and scary is how close this might have actually come to being at least started, right? Even if Roosevelt had never stepped in, right, these ships would never have been even completed. Maybe yard expansion would have started to happen, materials would have been started to gather, right? Maybe even a keel is laid, right? But if everything else sort of holds the same, right, you're never actually getting anywhere with this.
Yeah, as soon as Molotov-Ribbentrop is signed, right. There's no way we're selling this to them anymore.
Well, it's actually funny because that same Molotov, right? Samuel J. Karp is married to Molotov's daughter. He is actually brought to Moscow, mm-hmm. right? And out comes Stalin, right? And it's like, I need you to get me battleship stuff. Mm-hmm. And he's like, what's that mean? And he's like, so he goes to New York, sets up this basically fake import-export company, right? With a blank check from Stalin. And he's like, get me U.S. battleship stuff. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Like literally anything you can get your hands on. So Stalin was like, that means from basic plans to guns, fire control, like armor plating, all the way up to just buy me a battleship. Like they were looking at like West Virginias and that sort of class and like New Mexico and sort of like the dreadnoughts, sort of the later one. And
they are more up to date than any of the former Russian imperial ships that the Soviet Union had.
Right. So they were like, just buy me battleships if you have to, right? And then of course at the same time this is going on, he's also done the same thing with the Italians, but not as sort of direct like that. Russian designers approach Italian shipyards for designs and concepts, But yeah, it's just a very, very strange story. And I think, it's it's just a piece of history. These plans were donated to the Naval Institute last year, and the whole reason why we're doing this is because another one of our friends, Drac Innefel, he commissioned, subvented as we call it, this book, which is Russian and Soviet Battleships by Stephen McLaughlin. And this came out in the fall of last year. And so this book originally came out in the late 90s and was around in the early 2000s and then went away for a while. And so he helped bring this back into production. And the story of this ship and a lot of other ships similar to this are told in this book. Also, if you're a World of Warships player, pretty much every Russian battleship design that's in that game is covered in this book. And again, this book came out originally in the 1990s, so this predates Wargaming and World of Warships and all of them. This is not a World of Warships plug. It's just there's a lot of overlap here. They were nice enough though to provide this cover artwork for the book though, so I do have to mention that at least.
And I think it's worth pointing out that if you're a naval historian around Jack or mine or Drac Innefel's age, by the time we started collecting our libraries, this book was out of print and too expensive to get. So it wasn't until Drac and Naval Institute Press partnered up to reproduce it that I was able to get a copy. So let's go through the blueprint bow to stern and just talk about a couple of the design features. First off, this bow looks incredibly familiar to me, and it is not a modern U.S. Navy like fast battleship bow, is it?
No, I mean it's definitely not Dreadnought, era, but it doesn't. It's not. When you see the plan sort of top down, it's not long and sort of thin like Iowa's. It's very similar actually to, if you could see it in 3D, it's very similar to North Carolina and South Dakota, sort of how, like, in the way that it kind of, the bluntness of it.
Interesting. To me, at least in side profile here, it looks very similar to the older Tennessee and Colorado classes, even down to the three anchors there.
Right.
And the flat deck so you can fire dead ahead, which the fast battleships start to get a little bit of an upward rake. So it's interesting that they're designing this in the 1930s with like 1918, 1919 features. Whereas by this point, North Carolina's already gone through like 40 different designs, some of which include hybrid battleship carrier design.
So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how much detail Gibbs and Cox put into this, whether it's just like, okay, the ship's got to have a bow in this drawing, we'll just draw it on there. If the ship actually was going to be built, oh, quick, like let's, add some North Carolina in here, let's do this, let's do that. So who knows actually, he just said copy paste, Colorado, end of story.
If I was building this as a model, this is textbook definition of kitbashing. You just take a couple of the incomplete models you have and you're like, well, let's take this bow and these guns and old tripod superstructure.
Right, and that's what it is too. I mean, this is cut and paste, 16-inch 45 guns, right? So, I mean, the turret looks, at least, when it's rendered out, looks to be straight from North Carolina. Yeah, it's very much so. The secondary battery, too, it's a lot of, twin-mounted 5-inch 38s, but they're the older,
style mounts.
Yeah, the really elongated back.
And they're kind of just randomly placed as well,
And this is wide enough to have twin mounts? Looking at it in side profile here, I assume they were single mounts.
Yeah, no, at least in some of the other designs, that there's one design in this book as well as this, and then also rendered in 3D by, World of Warships. Yeah, you do end up with the twin-mounted 5-inch 38s, right.
And the fact that some of these are mounted so high is crazy for top weight.
No, exactly. And then, as we were talking about before, the armored conning tower is the top of the conning tower is the point of the flight deck.
It's interesting. We've got a two-tier conning tower there, so that's maybe an admiral and a captain's, or maybe a redundant fire control position.
Right, perhaps. And then sort of like New Jersey in her early form, where everything's exposed, you don't get sort of the bridge until later on. So that reminds me exactly, just like like that. So, and then you sort of have the older style, sort of mass, right?
Now, I've always seen this drawn as with a cage mast, but this looks like girders. It doesn't look like either a cage or a tripod.
Right, exactly. And one of the earlier drawings I saw, it was cage, right? So this looks like a much older U.S. battleship. And then here, at least in this drawings, you end up with this sort of girder, tripod-looking structure, right? So that's also very odd. And then you have, moving back a ways, you also have sort of this single funnel, right, with this funnel cap, which is, interestingly enough, sort of very reminiscent of Graf Zeppelin, right?
Yeah, that is not an American-looking funnel cap.
And I thought that what I thought was really interesting was when I first saw the 3D renderings with that funnel cap, I was like, wow, that's just like copy-paste, But then when this showed up and it has the funnel cap, I was like, oh, that's interesting.
It's weird to me because it's mounted so low. Like this exhaust gas is coming out right where the planes are trying to land, whereas contemporary American designs, look at the Lexington or the Yorktown class with those really huge monolithic smokestacks.
Right. What's interesting too is think about the engines, So, and again, this might just be Gibbs and Cox, like, I'm going to design this battleship. I'm going to put stuff in places. It doesn't have to make sense because at the end of the day, I'm trying, not to get, murdered in the night by Stalin, right? And so
ice picks everywhere.
Right, exactly. And so, but think about it. If you have 6 shafts, right, over that many, like boiler rooms and everything else, right? I mean, you got to think the engine space must take up a considerable portion of the midship section.
Everything between the turrets, I would think. So you're trunking things from these boiler rooms to...
So, exactly. So, I mean, you saw sort of remember in the original Lexington when it was a battle cruiser? Yeah. Think about the funnel placement on that.
As many as 7 on some of the earlier designs.
Exactly. So you're telling me you have all these engine rooms, 6, right? I'm assuming 6 shafts, right? And you're going to trunk all of that to this single funnel coming out, on the one side. So yeah, there's many things in this design that point to the fact that this is just a fantasy ship that Gibbs and Cox was just trying to get out, have some fun with. I don't think there was a lot of actual thinking here that, I need to actually design something that could possibly be built.
Yes, another interesting feature here, the 3-tiered fire control towers, common to the standard type battleships. The top 2 tiers were for aiming the main battery, and the lower tier was for the secondary battery. Except we've also got secondary battery directors all over the place in addition to that. So that's really weird. Looks like we've got a 1.1-inch Chicago piano there and another one back there. So, and that looks like a 50 caliber. Oh yeah, so they've got a couple of these on the catwalks like a traditional carrier.
Right. So, and just as a disclaimer, the model that you see in World of Warships is it's not this. So it's the hypothetical, this gets built and it gets completed to plan. The U.S. Navy takes it over and then modernizes it during World War II, right?
The 40 millimeters and the 20 millimeters.
You end up with sort of, World War, the latest in 5-inch 38 twin mounts, right? 40 millimeter Bofors, 20 mils everywhere.
There's certainly deck space for them.
So that sort of deal. And then you don't have, the large, fire, directing mass and everything else. You have traditional fire control and other things. So, the model in game is a bit of a hodgepodge. And I just wanted to point that out for people who might have noticed that as well.
So the last major thing I want to point out here is aircraft handling. Like you've got the catapult and cranes at the fantail, like is common on American battleships, for launching scouting planes for observing the fall of shot of the main battery guns. But then you've got this huge hangar facility and flight deck. Whereas this, you've got to basically stop so that the plane can land in the water and taxi and be picked up. But you've got a flight deck. So it makes no sense that you've got both of those. But also, we've talked a little bit about the aircraft so far. Issei and Tayuga were not carrying a carrier strike group. They were basically carrying spotting planes because the fleet carriers of the Japanese Navy did not scout for themselves like the U.S. Navy carriers did.
So we'll talk about hybrid ships here for a moment, right? So you had cruisers like Tone, for instance, right, who were kind of like hybrid in nature by design, right? So, the main battery is all forward on those cruisers. So in the rear, you have sort of this huge complement of float scout planes, right? And obviously, they're all float planes. So the idea, they all have to land on water, be recovered, be brought back on board, right? All right. So then when you get to Issei later on, the idea is we've lost all these carriers, right? We have to get planes on board ships somehow. So the idea is we're going to put bombs on essentially planes, launch them off of these carriers, and if the planes get through, that's great. If they get a strike off, fantastic. After that, is anyone's guess.
They're not landing on the battleships.
They're not. Most of them aren't float equipped, and the idea is that if you get through, right, and you're going to come back, you got to find somewhere to land or ditch. So these were, those ships were just a waste of material. And it's actually, fun fact, the steel of the fourth Yamato class battleship that had been laid down, so not Shinano, but the fourth one, the unnamed ship, the steel from that hull went into creating the aircraft sort of facility on Issei. So, just
some recycling there,
It's interesting. The U.S. Navy had some hybrid cruiser designs as well from the 1930s that you can look at in Friedman's U.S. Cruisers Illustrated Design History, which is another recent re-release of Naval Institute Press. So again, all that is linked in the description below. Friedman's series is one of my favorites, consulted very frequently, but very much from a time period when maybe carriers aren't going to be able to operate on their own, so they need guns to be part of the battle line and also be able to operate carriers. And that design reminds me very much of such Tone's design or Mogami's rebuild after her aft turrets are destroyed.
Right, exactly.
And those are not built, but we do turn some light cruisers into the Independence class carriers in Camden, New Jersey, very near where Battleship New Jersey is right now. Except they delete the gun turrets and decide hybrid designs are stupid and just make it a full carrier.
Yeah, in the attempt to make something do both, you end up with a ship that, can't really do anything well. So you compromise firepower, you compromise the air group, and at the end of the day, it's just a big target.
Yeah, roughly, if this is 1,000 feet, this is maybe 400 or 500 feet for the flight deck?
Yeah, it's 400 some odd feet is what the exact number. I'm not exactly too sure, but it was 400 in that range feet, correct? Flight deck amidships, where the traditional superstructure of like a Montana would be. If again drawing parallel to Montana, a really large, 12-gun super battleship. Obviously never built, but this is very, being similar to that.
Except it's got the flight deck and hangar capability of a Bogue class escort carrier.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Potentially about 30 aircraft for a flight deck that size, and presumably a hangar that's taking up all this space too.
Right.
So yeah, and depending on plane size as well, and their armaments, scouts here and there, but yeah, just exactly.
All right, so about 20 minutes ago in this discussion, we posed the question of what do we think this would have been completed as if the U.S. Navy had launched it and then get pulled into World War II.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts? I've definitely got some thoughts.
Exactly. So, if World War II happens, keeping everything else the same, you have this gigantic armored hull, and let's just say, there's no guns, no anything. World War II breaks out. I think it's completed as an aircraft carrier, right? I mean, we've already converted 2 gigantic battle cruisers, Lexington and Saratoga, from sort of, something similar.
About 120 feet shorter.
Right. I think this ends up being like some gigantic armored carrier that they send, that it gets completed. But the problem is, Essex is already, so again, keeping everything else the same, right? So, right, all those designs are already coming. This almost could be like Vanguard, where it's like, all right, let's finish this as a carrier. So now we have this carrier project that's a one-off, right? And then as the war progresses, work on it slows, it's finished, the war ends, cool, look at this, right? And then it's scrapped immediately, I mean, obviously Vanguard wasn't scrapped immediately, but,
I could almost see it taking the place of Midway or the post-war America designs, where this is the length of a supercarrier.
Right.
So rather than starting Midway, which is finished immediately post-war, or one of the Midway class carriers, just put that resources into finishing this one. But I agree with you. Almost certainly, they never put the guns on it. They use the armored barbettes that are already in the hull as like bomb stowage for the aircraft, and they just make a huge flight deck. And maybe, since it's a carrier, they allocate resources to it. And we're saying she's laid down in 39?
Yeah, 38, late 38, 39.
Okay, okay. So then she's launched in 41. They take a year to convert her, 42. That's when things are real rough in terms of carriers. So the earliest we'd see this finished is like 44, when we've got plenty of Essexes and it's the late war push. So yeah, she could make it out there in time for the invasion of Japan and probably nothing else.
Right. So you end up with this one-off trophy ship, and that's about it. And I don't think it sticks. You have 6 shafts, which require a lot of fuel, a lot of engine to move this, right? You have other carriers that are operating on half, and so this thing just becomes a gigantic, expensive trophy. I don't think it sticks around very long.
But the first U.S. Navy jet aircraft test flies in 1945, so we know aircraft are becoming bigger and bigger, and that is ultimately why we go to a 1,000-foot supercarrier about a decade later.
That's very true.
So you could be absolutely right. Jets all of a sudden come on the scene, and this ship serves as a test bed for future classes, right? So it's not necessarily like we like the hull design, but we know we need this amount of space in the hangar. This is, as plane sizes get bigger, the armor, the armored decks, thicknesses of that, support structures, everything else, we need this much space. So no, you're absolutely right. So even if it's used as a test ship, and maybe it ends up in Korea or, maybe Vietnam, I don't know, but I don't think it sees much action besides that.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. I like the thought of, hey, maybe instead of Antietam, this is the first American angle-decked carrier.
Right. I mean, who knows? I mean, again, this is all speculation, so maybe they love it. And you're right. Then it's modernized, and here we are in the 1980s, right, with this.
Whatever.
Let's send it to Gulf War I with Midway or Coral Sea, whichever one was over.
So, I mean.
You have this huge platform, capable of over 30 knots, that's armored, right, against 16 to 18-inch shells. What's a missile, right? Well, I mean, okay, in fairness, but yeah. So who knows? Again, if you're right, we keep the midways. Why not? So, yeah, very interesting. But I appreciate you taking a look at this.
So how do you guys think she'd be completed? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also a number of other private individuals and businesses like the U.S. Naval Institute. Remember, there's a link in the description below, and they're running a huge holiday sale right now, so you can buy books like this one that talks about the carrier we've just spent the last half hour talking about, and a number of other
bunch of other products, right? So yeah, between the books, you can also get discounts on membership. So we are running the holiday sale right now, which is 50% off, but normal members of the United States Naval Institute get 40% off books, as well as access to Proceedings and Naval History magazine. Also, For instance, if you like this topic and you like Naval History Magazine's a good resource. Earlier this year, when we got these plans, I did an article in Naval History Magazine about them. So stuff like this does come out, and we do publish it. So if you're interested, you can get all that on our website, and that'll be linked down below.
Thanks, Ryan.
And you can support Battleship New Jersey by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about us and our museum. Thanks for watching.